In 1787, while America's founding fathers were busy drafting the Constitution, few people realized some of their ideas had already been tested thousands of miles away, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Yes, the empire Americans hardly mention in textbooks may have quietly influenced how the U.S. government was designed. It wasn't all powdered wigs and Enlightenment philosophers. Sometimes it was turbans and Turkish legal systems. The Ottomans had mastered something the Europeans struggled with: religious coexistence. Through the millet system, they allowed religious communities to govern themselves under their own laws, maintain their own schools, and settle disputes in their own courts. Jews followed Jewish law, Christians followed canon law, and Muslims followed Sharia, yet all were subjects of the same empire. This was not just tolerance, it was organized diversity. And it deeply impressed Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire, who later influenced the U.S. Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote "All men are created equal," actually owned a Quran, and not just as a souvenir. He studied it. The Enlightenment was fascinated by Islamic legal and political traditions, especially those of the Ottoman Empire, which had maintained order across continents for centuries. These writings helped shape Western ideas about justice, rights, and pluralism. When Jefferson and Madison talked about balancing liberty and order, they weren't just talking theory. They were adapting real-world systems that had worked elsewhere. One of the lesser-known facts: the U.S. adopted its concept of checks and balances partly by observing the Ottoman Divan, a council that advised and constrained the Sultan's power. Though not democratic by modern standards, the Divan included viziers and religious leaders who could push back against bad decisions. This kind of power sharing wasn't common in European monarchies. Yet in the Ottoman world, it had been working for centuries, often more effectively than Europe's royal courts. And don't get us started on the postal system. The Ottomans had one of the most efficient communication networks of the early modern world. Couriers on horseback relayed messages across deserts, mountains, and empires with speed that made Europe jealous. Benjamin Franklin, America's first postmaster general, was so impressed that he studied the Ottoman courier model. The U.S. Postal Service owes more to Istanbul than to England. Meanwhile, American diplomats had their first real tests of global diplomacy in Ottoman territory. In 1783, Morocco, an Ottoman ally, became the first country to recognize the United States. The U.S. signed its first international treaty not with Britain or France, but with a Muslim sultan. That treaty guaranteed American ships protection in the Mediterranean in exchange for tribute. A humble beginning, but also a diplomatic victory, thanks to Ottoman customs of trade, negotiation, and mutual respect. Even architecture felt the Ottoman touch. The massive domes of the U.S. Capitol and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello bear uncanny similarities to the silhouettes of Ottoman mosques and public buildings. This wasn't just a design choice. It was a symbol of enlightenment and grandeur that echoed Hagia Sophia more than it did Roman cathedrals. The Ottomans were masters at mixing function and aesthetic. Americans took notes. And when it came to legal structure, the Ottoman Empire had pioneered civil courts, family law, and even legal rights for women. Women could own property, sue in court, and inherit wealth. This was shocking to European visitors in the 1600s and 1700s. Early American women had none of those rights until much later. In some ways, Ottoman women of the 16th century had more legal power than American women of the 18th. That's not just irony, it's a rewriting of what we think progress looks like. Trade was another Ottoman strength that inspired the U.S. to build its economy. The Ottomans controlled vital land and sea routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Their trade networks were vast, sophisticated, and culturally inclusive. American merchants wanted in, and they modeled many of their early commercial treaties after Ottoman protocols, formal, respectful, and full of subtle strategy. Who knew pistachios and silk could teach international economics? Let's not forget military structure. While American forces were still organizing themselves, they observed Ottoman tactics, particularly how the Janissaries operated with strict discipline, elite training, and centralized command. Though the U.S. never fully adopted this model, the concept of a standing, professional military had an early example in the Ottoman ranks. It was admired and a little feared. Even the idea of balancing secular authority with religious diversity had echoes of the Ottoman way. The U.S. system of separating church and state wasn't just a rebellion against European theocracy, it was also an appreciation of how a state could maintain unity without demanding uniformity. The Ottomans never forced religious conversion, nor did they demand uniform beliefs. That kind of pluralism was rare and remarkably modern. James Madison wrote about factionalism and how multiple competing interests would prevent tyranny. The Ottoman Empire had been doing this for centuries, managing Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Arabs, Jews, Albanians, and more, each with distinct legal and cultural identities, was no easy task. But it worked more often than not. And it showed the world that a multi-ethnic, multi-faith state was possible. Benjamin Franklin, often credited as the American Da Vinci, admired civilizations that blended practicality with vision. That's why he studied not only France and England, but also the East, including the Ottoman Empire. Franklin knew that wisdom wasn't exclusive to the West. It came from anyone who could build roads, run schools, govern peacefully, and deliver the mail on time. So when you hear people say the U.S. was founded solely on Roman ideals and English common law, pause for a second. The truth is, America's blueprint included more global ink than we admit. Yes, democracy came from Athens. Yes, liberty echoed from London. But tolerance, pluralism, and real-world strategy, some of that came wrapped in silk and sealed with an Ottoman stamp. If you enjoyed this untold slice of history, smash that like button, subscribe to Zyntra, and drop us a comment. What other hidden influences shaped modern nations? Because sometimes, to understand the West, you have to look east.